Hello, my name is David Disraeli, and I'm a Jewish believer. This is my story. It begins when I was 9 years old, and I was over at my friend's house, Sean O'Shea. Sean was Catholic, and he told me that he was praying for me. And I said, why? And he said, because I don't want you to go to hell. I said, what are you talking about? And he said, well, if you don't believe in Jesus, we believe you're going to hell. Well, I don't know what to make of that. I wasn't taught much about Jesus, except that was not our God. We believed in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I was born Jewish. I was raised Jewish. I was bar mitzvahed. And I went to 2 years of almost full-time Hebrew school, learning to read and write Hebrew, learning the Bible, translating it from Hebrew to English. And that was how I was brought up. In our household, the subject of God and creation, why we were here, never really came up. Being Jewish was more of a social or cultural endeavor. So you were expected to learn Hebrew. You were expected to be bar mitzvahed. And so I was. I never questioned it. I never thought much about it until I was in junior college. In my first year, I began to think about the Soviet Empire having all the nuclear weapons that they possess, basically aimed at the United States, and vice versa. We had nuclear weapons basically, pointed at them. So, in my mind, the very real possibility that man could destroy himself was now technologically possible. And I was trying to come to grips with that when I took a class from a guy named Bob Little in government. Bob Little was fervent about politics, about government, about world events, about everything that was going on in the world. It was almost like he read every newspaper, listened to every news program, watched every news television program, and just absorbed all this information. And I really didn't have a clue, but I was fascinated by this individual in his class. I was not much of a student in high school. I barely graduated. I didn't care about school. I just wanted to wait till the bell rang so I could go home or go party with my friends. This guy got my attention. And so I began to listen to the radio, the news radio. I began to read the newspaper. I began to become curious about what was going on around the world, not just in the United States, but everywhere. And this was around 1983, 82. And I was 19 years old. One night, I was having a margarita with a friend of mine, actually more than one. And our waiter happened to go to that same school, and I'd seen him around, but I never really actually met him. And he was at our table, and all of a sudden he starts talking about the book of Revelation and the end times, and a visitation he had when he was in his bedroom from Satan, where the temperature dropped 20 degrees instantly, and papers began to fly around the room. And I asked him if he'd ever done LSD. And he said yes, but I wasn't hallucinating. Satan is real. So 2 weeks later, I dropped by the professor's office, Bob Little, and I asked him point blank, do you believe there's going to be another major war, World War III? He said, yes, I do, without even thinking about it. I said, do you believe it's going to be nuclear? He said, yes, I do. Well, I turned around and left. I was just terrified. I mean, who wouldn't be? I had my whole life in front of me, and now the Bible is saying man's on a collision course with himself, and reality is saying man's on a collision course with himself. So I began to think about all of this stuff. Fast forward a couple of years, I got into the life insurance business. This was the first attempt at doing financial planning, and it was through life insurance. And my whole entire office was believers, Christians or Baptists. I really didn't know that at the time, but it turned out to be the case. And one by one, they began to share with me and to minister to me, but I didn't pay much attention to it. But there was one agent in that office that stood apart. This man had his act together. He was a family man. He had good posture. He had nice clothes. He had the right speech. And he was making a lot of money. Even now, it would be a lot of money. And this is 30 years ago. So I would go by his office when his door was open and say, hey, can I talk to you? And just try to get some nuggets of information about how to be successful in the business. And one day he said, you know what, David? you can be Jewish and believe in Jesus. I said, what are you talking about? There's no way. He said, well, of course you can. James did it. Mark did it. Matthew did it. Jesus himself did it. I said, oh, okay. And then he said, let me ask you a question. Do you want to bet everything on what your parents taught you, how you were raised, or whether that was correct? And it just hit me like a sledgehammer. I didn't know how to respond, and so I didn't respond. What he was saying is, basically, you're going to go to hell if you believe what you believe now. And what you believe is how you were raised, not because of any, academic research or inquiry. And he said, David, you're a very, very bright kid. If you just look at the evidence, you will figure it out. And that's all he said. I said, okay. He said, just tell God, if this is real, show me. I thought, well, I don't have anything to lose, so I did. And the more I thought about it over the next couple of years, it just made sense to me that, our calendar back then was 1985, I guess. Yeah, 85. So 1,985 years after what exactly? If Jesus was just a prophet, which is what I was told, why is it that the entire world's calendar is based on his death? The death of a lunatic, the death of a liar, or the death of God himself? And that was a question that began to fester inside me for a couple more years. One day, I decided, I guess this was 2 years later, that I was going to call this gentleman up and go have coffee with him. And he said, David, you got to get into fellowship. I had no idea what that meant. He said, there's other Jewish believers in Dallas. I said, there are? He said, yeah, I'll call the pastor of the congregation and see if he can get a hold of you. Well, he did, and one of the parishioners named Mark Solo called me up one night, and he gave me his testimony. And his testimony was powerful. He had an actual visitation, and he became a believer. That didn't happen to me, and I still was not, quote-unquote, a believer. It made sense to me, but I also had spirit guides. I had all sorts of divination, rune stones, which is sort of like tarot cards that I sought information from. And I had Jesus. So I had a little bit of Jesus, a little bit of New Age, a little bit of witchcraft, and I had my cornucopia of input, I guess you would say. So around about this time, I called a friend of mine who was a doctor at the Aerobic Center in Dallas, which is a huge cardio workout facility that had on-staff physicians for people that had, high incomes that could afford it. And I asked him, I said, did you ever question your faith? He said, no, I never have. I said, you never did any investigation? He said, no. I said, why? He said, David, there's nothing that can explain the life change, the changed lives that I've seen. He's a doctor, scientific, if it weren't real. And I said, wow, here I am trying to figure it all out. He said, you know what? I have a book you might want to read. I said, what? He said, it's called Betrayed. It's about a successful Jewish man who has a 21-year-old daughter who goes off to college and comes home a Christian. And the book is about how he became a Christian, trying to explain to her why it wasn't real. I got a hold of that book, and I started to dive into it. And I saw scriptures in my Old Testament I'd never seen before that describe Jesus word for word, 600, 700, 800 years before he was ever born. My Bible. How did the rabbis miss it? How did my people miss it? It said he was wounded for our transgressions. By his stripes we were healed. They pierced him. It's all in there. And in the middle of that book, when this man is having his most intense struggle, I remember it was Friday, January 13th, 1989. I fell on the ground and I saw Jesus rise up out of the grave. And I knew that it was real. And I said, oh my God, I am sorry it took me this long. Come into my life, take my life and do something with it. And that's exactly how I got saved. I've never been the same since. He's given me a wife, an amazing wife, an amazing family with 4 children, an amazing business. Most of all, He's given me peace in my heart, rest for my soul. And no matter what happens, I have Him, and I'll be with Him for eternity. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you'll share it with your friends. Thank you.